Hey, bonjour y'all, Adrian Lambert here. Welcome or welcome back on my channel. Today we're gonna keep exploring USD, and if you haven't seen my previous videos about Solaris and USD, definitely check them out because this video right here is pretty much the end game of my series. There might be an extra video about lighting, maybe render settings and some extra trick. In this video, we're gonna put everything into practice into this little assembly. So we'll make sure our USD scene is properly layered and organized in a way that allows us to export for another software like Unreal Engine, Omniverse, etc. So yeah, we'll see how that works right there. So I'll share how I basically build this scene. It's not necessarily super complicated. But you can see the benefit of it where once you have a scene set up with something like Comma XPU with Material X and all that good stuff we talked about, it's running fairly fast actually. Like I can easily adjust my camera, navigate in my scene. So yeah, and if I want, I can also reverse the light rig to something else. Like I have different options right there, as you can see. So I can pick this broad daylight one if I want. And that's looking, well, pretty cool. I mean, it's a simple scene. So I'll show you first how we can work on the terrain on which we can scatter some assets, right? So let's get started. So you can see I am in stage, and the first thing I have on the top of my graph is a terrain. As you can see, I build it in a way where actually the most foreground area is much more detailed than the rest, where for the rest of the terrain, it's pretty basic and low res. Well, this one is actually pretty detailed in the center and kind of fade to less dense polygon. So I'll show you how I did that. Just need to go back in OBJ. So in OBJ, I have this height field right here that basically showcase how I build it. So I'll probably go back to a regular Houdini build configuration. Let's see. Yeah, that's the guy. So how does that work? So as you can see, we are starting initializing the height field. It is a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer multiplied by uniform scale of 0.5. That makes it 500 meter. If you don't know metric system, I can't do anything for you. Moving on, we have a height field mask border. So this is a custom node that are part of my AL tools on Gumroad. So if you don't have it, it should be pretty easy to make it with just a bound and mask by object. And yeah, just basically been exposing some padding and some blurring option right there. So this just allow me to get some control just over the center of the height field. What I'm doing here is mixing the mask with a mask by objects. And this is basically the shape of our pathway, which is very straight in this case. I initially started drawing a crazy curve and be like, okay, I'm gonna shape that and it's gonna look great. But in the end, we didn't have a great sense of perspective. So that's why I ended up doing a transform to basically get a very straight path and just a polywire to shape it. So polywire, we now get a volume out of it, and we can use that as a mask to basically draw the path on our terrain. So preparing my mask, fairly easy stuff, remapping this mask to get something a bit sharper, where I'm remapping, in that case, the mask, and well, input min and max to control how it fade. So some volume wrangles right here is just to elevate the depth attribute, also the height attribute. I'm just using a custom offset to elevate this guy. So we have a couple of different elevation right here. I'm multiplying by the mask so that my height field is just, elevating this part nicely. And I'm mixing those both heights, which is, this one is very small, as you can see, 0.28 against 1.4. So yeah, I'm here creating a much more complex mask. Was just basically adding some noise on top of it. And well, once you layer both, you start to get something interesting happening. So yeah, that's the first step, creating this kind of elevation. And I'm then having another layer of height, minor breakup, where things are pushed a bit more on the side. It's pretty minor, I guess, but it does help convey some nice breakup on the road. Otherwise it was a bit too sharp everywhere. So it's basically the same setup duplicated. So the difference here is, I think the height field remap is slightly different. Yep. So looking at here, we got something remapped this way. This one is remapped this way. And I'm basically mixing both masks to get this sort of breakup. Then I'm doing more mask operation, this time to extract the middle of both squares right here, just by shrinking the mask with a height field blur that I set to shrink, and remapping more, doing some mask blur, well, adding some noise on this area just to kind of get some something less flat on these sections. Yep. And in this case, I'm redoing the same type of thing where I'm adding some value based on the height that's multiplied on the mask, so it's only affecting the red area. And yeah, what else? Moving on, we have, oh, just a visualizer for the color. So I basically created a mask right here by features to extract this mask, which is, I think, based on the height and the slope. This is what it is. What am I doing here? Heightfield copy layer, I'm copying the mask here into another layer that I'm calling path. So this way I'm storing some extra data. We now have height, mask, and path. So this is embedded within my height field. The quick shade is just some color based on this, this attribute path. And well, applying some kind of ground color, some kind of brownish stuff right there. And yeah, at this point I'm doing more distortion overall to make things less perfect, adding some noise, some more distortion. So the distortion actually help break up the road quite a lot, as you can see. So otherwise it tends to be pretty smooth. And moving on, I'm cropping a big section of the terrain because it's not worth keeping all this section that won't be seen in camera. I always keep in mind that, okay, my angle's gonna be like something over here or here. We're gonna be pretty low, covered with trees, so no way we're gonna see the rest of the terrain. I'm doing a resample there just to get some extra detail. So basically resolution scale by 5. So moving on, we can detail the path now, like this kind of trail on the middle of the road. To do so, I'm reusing the curve we created with another polywire and doing a mask by object to create a mask based on this polywire right here. And what's pretty cool is that, well, first I'm storing that as an attribute we'll call middle source. That I like to reuse within my scatter because I know that maybe this middle section will be filled with maybe some grass and the rest will be much more rocky, or yeah, we'll see. So what I'm doing here is increasing the height on this mask. It's pretty subtle, actually, it's barely visible. Mask by object, I'm continuing creating some masks, this time based on this element where it's very much the same thing that you saw based on this path. I'm doing a sweep to extract 2 curves out of it using the cable generator to distort it. We can even, like, you know, create some more intricate trails. So basically I'm using that to creating maybe some tires trail, this kind of thing. but I'm happy with this density, and I'm reprojecting the curve on the terrain, doing some groups. In that case, I just want to keep anything that is in the terrain, because otherwise all these points are gonna be useless. So I'm kind of just keeping this. Those are pretty minor adjustments, to be honest. So if I'm looking much further, it's still looking the same. I think it's pretty old setup. So yeah, what I'm doing here is just meshing it with a polywire, introducing a mountain to kind of create some more irregularities. Anyway, I'm happy with that. And I'm using that as a mask to keep detailing my road. So yeah, what am I doing there? So I'm storing this mask as trail A. So at this point, we have an extra attribute we can use later in our scattering called trail A. So that's going to be a useful one. And mask by noise. What am I doing here? Just doing some breakups on this mask, just so we can later on create some puddles. And I think using a remap to contrast it a little bit, and just decreasing the elevation to create our puddles. So later on, this is gonna help a lot to create some nice variation and break up on our terrain. So yeah, this method was actually giving a pretty decent result out of the box. And what am I doing here? Combining some layers. So I'm just combining the middle source with the current mask. What else? Doing some more mask manipulation for the middle, like kind of trying to extract this nice red strip so that we can have some decent scattering later. And yeah, at this point, we are ready to do more cropping. So what I'm doing here, it's basically just extracting the most high-res portion of my terrain. I know that I want my shot to focus in this portion, and the rest would be much more like in background, right? So I'm appraising this section by three times denser, and doing some distortion just to get things a little bit more interesting. So I'm mixing, I think, 2 different levels of noise. And also I don't forget to distort the extra layer like middle source or any layer that you'd need, actually, because otherwise you're gonna have some discrepancies on your attribute. And yeah, that's pretty subtle thing, but that add quite a bit of detail down the line, where we have some pretty cool distortion fading on the side. So it does give a lot of detail down the line. And yeah, trying to add some extra noise here. I think it's much more like on this middle section. Yep, that's very subtle then again, but it really does make a difference. Once you start rendering this, it does bring some nice little bumps on this section. Detail tracks. So what have I been doing here? I think in this network, it's a bunch of different noise that I'm mixing with the original layer, this terrain. So things get pretty heavy as you kind of appraise stuff. So yeah, this is basically just adding some subtle deformations and stuff happening on the side. It gets pretty slow, so that's why I also kind of isolated this piece of Heightfielf so that things doesn't get too slow. Optimization will get you a long way there. What am I doing here? Yeah, just more elevation variation with this wrangle. And finally, I'm meshing everything. So to mesh everything, I actually have again this big mesh, this poly wire that represent the road, and doing a mask from geometry this time once everything is converted into Heightfielf. So what this does, I'm not going to launch it because that's probably going to be too slow, but I'm creating an attribute that I called, let me check, what did I call it? Retention. So mask from geometry, retention, it's gonna basically create a mask that fade from the center to the edge, I guess. And once we get this retention attribute called inside here, retain density by attribute, we are getting some density variation where now we can see that we are keeping the original mesh on the center, and everything as we go on the sides get much more poly reduced. So that's a good way to kind of optimize things and make sure that we are keeping detail only where we need to, because anyway the rest is going to be covered with grass, bushes, and etc. And finally, what I'm doing here is remerging everything with the rest of the terrain. And the rest of the terrain, as you can see, is much more low res. So there is a bit of overlap just to make sure that things blend still fairly nicely, but you know, it's so far away that in theory we shouldn't see too much what's happening there. And yeah, we keep things fairly optimized. So I just fight cached, by the way, this poly reduced terrain to make sure that we don't need to recompute everything every time we open the scene. Yeah, so file caching, that's an important step. Finally, what I'm doing here is using some attributes builder to basically get some more attributes for scattering. Maybe those one are useless. Maybe I don't honestly even remember if I'm using them down the line. But what do we have here? So yeah, in that case, I'm extracting just those slopes right here on which we may want some bushes and things like that. This one right there, we are extracting one side. And this mask right there is going to be helpful when it comes to assigning trees. And maybe we want, so we can say in our scatter, I want a rotation of trees going in this direction, because yeah, I kind of like having the trees flowing along the path, right? And have on the other side trees flowing in this direction. So to me, that was an important feature to have in this terrain, and that's why I actually needed a mask like that, so that we can split the scattering into two sets of trees. So to create this mask, what I've been doing was using the line and basically creating a cube out of it that basically encompasses the rest of the terrain right here, and we are making sure to fill it with some black. So value of 0, value of 1 on the outside, and this is just using mask by object. So pretty straightforward stuff. Finally, recaching everything, because yeah, it's good to cache your geometry one more time, especially in LOP. It tends to try to recook the terrain all the time, so that's why caching things will be very helpful. Finally, doing a color by ramp with this wet mud attribute I created that just gives us some color variation for display. And you know what? That's already a lot of information for the height field, right? So moving on, I want to talk specifically about USD now. So how do we import that? When it comes to managing a scene in USD and importing data and manipulating the hierarchy, one rule is never use absolute path. Why is that? So let's see, I'm just gonna duplicate this SOP import. Yep, this guy, I'll put it on the side just so I'm not messing up my current setup. And well, things are basically set up here in a way to work in a relative way. So relative way means based on other parameters. And you see this expression CHS is referencing a parameter that comes from another node. In that case, it's a node called control, and the parameter is called directory. So what does it look like when I got everything disabled? We have the primitive path right here is $OS. Let's just say terrainfg. And let's say I want to create a scatter on this terrain, right? So there would be multiple ways to do it. Maybe Instancer would be a good one to use. And what I want to do here would be lop import to basically import something in lop, which, okay, by the way, that's probably not how we would do, because right now it's kind of dumb because our terrain come from SOP. So we are bringing this SOP into lop to finally re-import the lop into SOP. That's really not an optimized way to work. If I would be smart, I would rather use an object merge and try to import the terrain based on an object merge from any object that is in OBJ. So yeah, I probably have my Heightfielf in here. So just, yeah, for clarification, you would rather use an object merge if you didn't move the terrain in a specific location. I think it's safer to use an object merge than a lop import. But let's say for the demonstration right here, I just need to bring my SOP import. So I just pin that will be easier. And I will drag and drop this SOP import. Boom. And in primitive, we need to declare which primitive are we bringing. So it's called terrainFG, since that's what's the name we give it. But what if for some reason down the line, we are modifying the name of the primitive, right? It's very likely that, oh, it turned out that it's called terrain hero something. So I don't know. Now the name is terrain hero. What's happening within the instancer? Is it still trying to bring the terrain hero? Look at that. It's actually still referencing terrainFG. So yeah, mind that any path that is referencing a primitive in Houdini is pretty dumb, and it will not update if you're trying to change the name of the primitive, which is pretty different in SOP, right? When you have a node in SOP that is referenced into another node, it would update automatically. This is not the case in stage, and that's where you want to be super careful and instead use relative path, right? So that's for this reason I added a custom parameter called primitive name. So this primitive name, I can reuse it in a lot of different sections of my graph. So the way to create it is just to take a string and bring it into the root right here. We could call this guy asset name or whatever you want, name, whatever. I'll call that terrain, right? And I will copy this parameter. So we can just use a simple copy. And the trick is just to right click, paste relative reference, and it will create this nice expression for us. So in that case, it's gonna create the name of my primitive terrain or terrain test or whatever it is in this name. And we could reference this name inside the lop import as well. This is the method that we choose to import the terrain. So in that case, you see that the relative path is different with this dot dot slash, which means go back a couple of contexts right here and look for a node called terrain1 and look for the parameter called asset name. That's what it means. And this is a string, control string. So yeah, pretty simple stuff, but at this point, whatever I change will always be updated in here. So that's something that's important, because otherwise, if you're going too far in the creation of your scene with absolute path and you're changing one thing, everything might break. So that's why I'm usually very careful and create relative path. And I create relative path not just for the primitive name, but for the USD location, because when you are manipulating a scene, what's happening in USD is that it's going to store any USD into a layer. So if you go in scene graph layer, you see that it's going to try and bring everything into some layer system, right? And it basically tells you if things are explicitly set. So that's back when I was talking about layering in the part 1, right? We saw that everything would get in a saved specific place. And if it is not set, it is then considered an implicit path, and Houdini would choose to save it for you, it would create a path itself that would look like crap, to be honest. So I would be very careful and rather always set an explicit path for every USD you save. So I know this is usually pretty annoying stuff to take in account, right, when you come from Maya or something else, but that's something very specific to USD, and that needs to be taken in account if you are creating a scene that is aimed to be shared with other artists or other department. If you are using Karma and Solaris just for rendering your own shot, and then maybe you don't care about that, and that's totally fine to skip these steps. But the way I usually proceed to make my organization solid to a point that I completely forget about it is just to reuse the same structure every time. And what I'm doing is creating this control null that reference different string parameter. In that case, we have the directory that will drive where I want to save all the USDs that are in my scene. So you have some USDs that you are bringing in your scene, like the Megascan and all that stuff. They won't get saved. They already saved. So what will Houdini save down the line is things that are coming from the sub create, sub import. So in that case, what I'm doing is specifying the name of my scene. That could be the name of the shot if you're working on shot, or if it is a specific environment, yeah, you could put the name in there. So I call this parameter scene, and that is what is referenced in there. So we would basically have the USD saved under the heap file location under a folder called forest in that case. And all those other parameters here are here to help me drive the structure of my hierarchy within my scene. So that's basically my outliner, where I know that all my scatter about environment will be set under an environment hierarchy. My lights will be under a lights hierarchy. The character, like my deer, will be under car, and maybe the fogs and any additional VDBs, FX will be under a hierarchy called VFX. So if I'm checking the end result right here, so looking at the final hierarchy we have in like defined in this null, we have the scene name forest that is represented right here, forest. Let me try, see if I can expand this bad boy. Yeah. So we have this forest, we have a car hierarchy that contains the stag, and we have environment that contain a few other hierarchy like hand-placed elements. We have IV dressing, we have different scatters, so that's all my instancers right there. And finally, it also contains different terrains for the background and for the foreground, and also the water. So for me, if I really want to organize things differently and say, I don't know, environment, I can always choose to do that, and the hierarchy will update. So what happened is my scene first didn't break. So that's a good point. Every element seems to display again. And in my scene, I see that everything updated with this environment hierarchy right there. And we still have the water, the terrain, the scatter, and everything under it. That's the kind of change that is pretty important in a production. And if you don't want to waste time trying to figure out why things are breaking, that's why it is very important to use relative path. So there are several ways you can implement relative path to drive hierarchy. And that's what I want to show you now, with also how to layer USD. Anyway, so what am I doing in here? I have a restructure scene graph. That's actually pretty nice if you need to rename a specific primitive. So what's happening is this restructure scene graph will take any, well, primitive in my case, and the new name PG terrain, I guess. So yeah, pretty simple way to make sure that I'm creating here a new primitive based on the original primitive, moving the terrain more in the back and remerging everything. So reminder here, why did I need to change the name? It's because a merge in USD would sublayer things. So what's happening is that if I'm not renaming that, it seems like it's doing nothing, right? But what's happening is that basically try to sublayer the current thing right here and just replace it, which is, yeah, not exactly ideal, right? And yeah, that's why you want to create a different name for this primitive. That's called BG terrain. Anyway, I like to use this restructure string graph. Actually, it can rename primitive, it can reparent primitive, we can do a lot of different things with it. We can remove reference, remove some variants, etc. So that's actually very useful. And in this case, you see that I'm using the relative path that was based on the null that I was creating like here. So control scene and environment is basically this forest and environment. So what it will do in this case is do a hierarchy that is basically slash forest slash environment slash terrain. So pretty nifty. It's now pulling every primitive that was originally at the root and pulling that under this forest environment terrain. So neat. Configure layer. So now that we have this setup, we can store this terrain into a USD. So one thing that can be worth mentioning is this restructure scene graph by default is gonna flatten your input layers. What it means, flattening, you can basically see that as a Photoshop layer where when you work, you can split things into different layers, and when you're happy, you want to maybe optimize your file, you want to flatten all your layers into one image, right? The problem with that is that if you need to go back and kind of extract one layer that you have, you're stuck because, well, things are flattened. And that's the same idea with USD and layering, you can flatten a layer. So it would kind of do that by default. You can always turn this off. In that case, it's gonna fail, but yeah, I guess that's worth mentioning. And one thing when it comes to layering, if I'm going here, let's actually, I found that sometimes it's a bit buggy where the layers doesn't necessarily update. I need to either restart the panel or, yeah, just to refresh it. But yeah, I would see, okay, I have my stage terrain. It is saved to implicit right now. We have the sub layer is basically saved. This is this layer saved right here that's controlling. If I'm disabling this, it's not gonna be saved. It's not set right now. So it's important to have this set all the time. And the way I usually proceed again is with relative path, where we have the directory that come from the null, and I'm storing things under a folder called USD, and the name would be based on this name, this primitive name that we define here, and underscore sub, because this is based on a procedural sub terrain, right? And now we have this sub layer, but it's also encompassed within a bigger USD, which is the current scene, right? And this one is not saved yet. That's why down the line, I have this configure layer, and configure layer is pretty useful to actually do that and save the current branch of this, this graph into a new layer that is, well, not exactly a new layer, it's already existing. That's the thing, it's just not set. So now we can save the path, we can define a default primitive if we want, just to make sure that it's bringing like forest. I use the relative path to control that. And well, I have some attribute wrangles here. I might talk about that later, but this is basically storing a prim var called myID. And this is used later for cryptomats. So I will talk about that maybe in another video when we talk about AOVs and all that stuff. So you can notice that I then have a few cameras already set up. So if I'm going here, I have this angle, and that will drive in my following section of the graph where I want the scatter to live. Maybe I don't want them to be behind. I don't want trees behind those cameras, just to optimize my scene. Because sure, we can go pretty far with instancing and have millions of objects, but at the same time, there is a cost to it, which is going to be loading into memory, and that can get pretty nasty sometimes. So that's why optimizing is always a good idea. So let's move on with scattering. So in this scene, when it comes to layout, I mostly took advantage of instancer to scatter some objects procedurally. Two things to take in account here is first, how do you import those objects? And I'm gonna repeat some things from the past tutorials, of course. In that case, it's very much using the layout lop to actually bring all the different USDs from the asset gallery, where we spend some time to assetize everything and get every USD ready in there. And I found just that convenient to drop any object you want to scatter in there. So what's happening is that for scattering, well, I'm dropping those USD using, let's say, a paintbrush, do a rough paint, and it will drop these prototypes, right? So every USD is now available of these different trees. Everything is set under this layer that is called set points. I mean, doesn't have much impact. It's just spitting every USD that is already saved in there. And what's happening is as soon as we plug that into a point instancer, it's gonna spit all those USD back in the main thing, where we have our height field, and we have now all those different European birch or anything that is scattered in there. So we see that everything in terms of USD path is explicitly saved or already saved. So that's the main benefit when it comes to this method. So to bring those different prototypes, you see that, well, we have a trees prototype folder. So the logic is fairly straightforward. We use this wildcard to bring any prototypes, I guess, that have something in the path before. In that case, it was called trees prototype. So no matter the name, it will bring it, and it will also bring everything that is after prototypes in the path. So that's just a procedural way to import everything. So when it comes to the primitive path, it is where you want to store the scatter within your graph in here. So in that case, it's very much about reusing the relative path that we define in the controller of the scene. So again, control scene, we have environment. I'm creating here scatter that will gather all the different scatter of my terrain. So anything like trees, bushes, grass will get referenced under this scatter. I could call that something else that doesn't really matter. So that's the way I'm using to deal with the hierarchy and keep it as flexible as possible. In terms of prototypes, well, we are using the second input, and potentially this only copy specified prototype doesn't really matter. So reminder about index attribute. An index is, in that case, a integer between 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Any point that have an index of 0, for example, will get the first prototype that is in the list of our different prototypes. In that case, that would be birch A, the second one would be birch B, etc. So you can always visualize that using index, but what that would do is just like purely display the index 0, right? So I kind of use that more as a way to debug and see like which model works best. So I know that this one is a bit too straight. Maybe I'm not gonna use it much. So we have this index 4. So that kind of gives me some clues on how I want to randomize my settings inside. And the way I randomize it is using an attribute randomizer that is set to discrete. And as I was saying, we have the different index right here, 0, 1, 2, with different weights. In that case, I'm increasing the weights of the second prototype in the list that I think worked well, had a nice bending, and setting to 0 the one that was straight. So yeah, that's kind of a trick I like to use. Reminder again here, when you want to import a terrain, if you already created in SOP, maybe just use an ObjectMerge to bring it. So importing a USD in SOP might be pretty fast, but actually unpacking it might be pretty slow. So I would say only use UnpackUSD only if you really have to. So yeah, worst case, I would always file cache it just in case so that it doesn't try to extract the UnpackUSD every time, okay? Whenever you can use ObjectMerge to merge something that comes from SOP, just do it. It's much easier. And in this case, what we see here is the mask I was showing you earlier, where we have a mask for the left trees and a mask for the right trees. And I'm using that to scatter some points, right? And making sure that all those points will have trees with a certain orientation. And the one from this over branch in here will get some other orientation. So I can change in my AL Advanced Scatter that you can find on Gumroad or Airbolt for the Pro version. You can always use that to drive the rotation of your objects. In the past tutorial, I showed you how you can manually create your own scatter system. It's a bit more manual work, but you can always do your own setups, or in my case, I like to use my Advanced Scatter because it combines everything I like about scattering, like camera culling, because it's very likely that I want to limit my scatter to a camera angle. So in that case, it's bringing a camera that was actually defined earlier. Remember when I was telling you in here, we were setting some camera for the scattering, that's what's happening. But I need first to bring them back into OBJ. So that's why I actually have here lop import cam, just to bring in OBJ some of the USD cam I was setting. And thanks to that, I can now bring this lop import cam in here and limit my scatter to these specific angles. So yeah, that's just a way to optimize things. So in theory, lop import cam 1, everything is limited to this and nothing behind it, right? A nice trick when you need to do some optimization, because sure, you can have millions of instances, but this will come with a cost at one point, whether it's at the export when you are trying to import in another software or whatever. It's I usually try to optimize whenever I can. Anyway, I'm caching the final result because it's always easier to kind of load just bgo.sc than kind of regenerating all this hierarchy all the time. And yeah, same thing for the background forest. One thing I should specify here, we have a configure primitive. Why do we have that? It's mostly to turn all the content of the prototypes from a kind that is basically originally component and turn that into group. So if you are working in Solaris and Karma and don't care about export, you may not worry about that. I think that would work totally fine without it. But if you're aiming to export to, let's say, Unreal Engine, it seems that it's important that the USD is set with this in mind. So yeah, just mind that. And moving on, it's pretty much the same technique everywhere, actually, where we have an instancer that is referenced with the relative path, like calling this one forest BG. So I usually have $OS, by the way, in here that reference just the name of the node. So that's just a convenient way to control the naming of all the different scatters. And yeah, doing the same for the bushes. So when it comes to the bushes, in that case, I think it's some elderberry asset from Megascan. So for those, I kind of scatter them around the trees. Same for the ferns right here. It's all based on the tree position. So it's pretty procedural. And the way I'm going about those is mostly by referencing, let's see, we have the terrain, and I'm using ScatterAlign in that case. So in ScatterAlign, what's great is that we can reference a second input and create some scatter around those points. So that's pretty interesting. You just need to set the mode to scatter points around constraint points. It would basically take these points and create more points. So pretty cool stuff. I mean, there's a lot of points obviously in here. So what I'm doing in the end is reducing the amount of point using my advanced scatter and even deleting more stuff. Yeah, so that's usually how I go about this. So when it comes to the dead leaves, so those are simply scattered on the ground, right? So we have this sort of effect where we have millions of leaves that are scattered, and everything is, by the way, running fairly fine. I'm making sure that my display is set to proxy, not render, so that everything is pretty low res in general. And this seems to hold up fairly nicely. So one thing I would say for the leaves, I have on one side a pack of leaves, which comes from, yeah, those guys. And what I'm doing here is bringing the USD straight in here. So remember that we have this asset gallery, layout asset gallery, boom. So that's great. It individually kind of publish some USD in there. The only thing is when a model has variant, well, it's gonna publish the model with its variant as one model, unless you kind of check this checkbox that create one kind of publish per variant. So I end up with elderberry var1, var2, etc. Or you have one big pack of leaves and that just contains all the 30 different USD. If I'm using explore variants, I can totally see that I have all my dead leaves, right? But yeah, that's a lot of leaves, and that's why I didn't want to create this system for those one. So thanks to this explore variants, I'm extracting all the variants that were contained by this asset that I published, dead leaves, this dead leaf pack, let's say. And I want to use that as prototypes, right? And at the same time, I need to make sure that the USD is referenced and created properly. So if I go in Solaris graph layers, I do see that we have quite a few layers. We have literally layers about layers on layers, etc. So I'm making sure that everything is set. So basically we have a sublayer that's kind of bringing all those USDs. So I'm configuring a first layer. Exploring the variants will create an overlayer that's extracting all the different primitive into one layer. So that's kind of tricky at this point. And then an overlayer need to be set so that we can save everything properly. So this part can get a bit, you know, confusing, and that's something that took me a while to figure out so that we can extract all those variants and use them as prototypes. But now what's pretty cool is that, okay, in prototype primitive, what I'm referencing is this prune exclude prim pattern. What the heck it is? It is basically on the other side, I use explore variants, and this one is basically using a different spacing just so I can lay out all my different leaves. And from here, I'm using a prune to basically go shopping. I'm deleting everything. I'm pruning every primitive, but I'm using this add exclusion basically to define which leaves I actually want to feed into my scatter. So this way I can always come and say, I want to add this green one, press enter, and here I know that all those different leaves might make their way into this specific instancer just by copy this parameter, pasting as relative reference, And now I know that everything will get the proper primitive I want. In that case, I don't bother doing an index attribute. I'm just randomizing everything because I don't care. I'm happy with this distribution. And the reason why we are splitting into two branches here is because if we are trying to feed that, all those sleeves into the instancer, it's going to create some offset because all those sleeves are not living at the origin of the world anymore. So this setup is nice when you have a USD that contains so many variants that would be like a pain to feed into something like a node like a layout lop and have like hundreds of elements to bring in there. So yeah, that's what I would flag here. And I'm actually doing the same for another pack, which is clovers. So I have those nice clovers, and I'm actually doing the exact same thing where I'm extracting all the different variants and feeding that randomly into this instancer. So all those instancers have different procedural features again, so I won't detail all of them because it would be a 2-hour tutorial. It's always based on the same nodes. So I'm basically combining different attributes I created with the middle bit that come from the Heightfielf and some noise that's driving those nice breakups. And yeah, that's basically how I'm kind of stacking different scatter on top of each other to create complexity here. Creating complexity in my scene is very much about having a varied source of asset, right? So for that, just look at some photos and make sure that you replicate what you see. I think it's the best thing to see, is very much relying on real world reference. I can't stress that enough because there is a lot of things to scrutinize and to get it right if you want things to get photoreal. So yeah, that's what it is. And then I'm basically continuing and scattering some more elements like wood debris. So I would have another instancer for that. Same, we have like some kind of what I call mud rocks, which is much more like some kind of pebbles, I guess. Yeah, those white dots right here, they don't have a material at the moment. I'm applying a material later, but moving on, we have some patch of grass elements, pretty cool flower detail. And you see that at this point, the scene is getting pretty heavy. We have some elements turning into cube. So that's where optimizing things will help a lot. Anyway, at this point, I'm done with scattering. So I have this switch right here, which is much more about simplifying things to display the terrain or just, yeah. So it's keeping quite a few nodes just for the sake of continuing with set dressing, etc., and optimizing some placement in here. So all those objects are pretty much hand placed just to either bring some nice shadows. So that's why I brought those trees right here, is mostly to break up my lighting. And those rocks are to enhance the composition. Same for the tree bark and all those stuff. So I'm very much using a simple reference. So reference will allow you to kind of import some USD asset and put them under a layer. Yeah, we have this reference one layer that contain our USD, European birch. And well, Stage Manager is basically a fancier way to import reference. And it would basically do the same thing. It's just a bit more convenient to use because we have some controls on those different objects, right, where we can manipulate them, we can duplicate, delete stuff, etc. So yeah, we talked a little bit already about Stage Manager, and we can bring things thanks to this window if we know where things are. So yeah, when it comes to handplay stuff, is very much when I have some cameras locked and I kind of know where I need to push some stuff for the sake of composition. In here, I knew that I needed to bring something for the foreground, get some point of interest here and there. And yeah, that's basically helping quite a lot down the line. And what else can I tell you here? Well, we have some material, also editing some material. That's something I haven't talked about, but you can always do it. In that case, it was editing the saturation of this tree right here, which was way too saturated actually. So the way to do that is just to get into the material, finding the one that kind of need to be edited and dropping it here in there. When you do load, it will load the shader and you can do any adjustment in here. So in my case, I think it was very much about creating a color correction and reducing the saturation of the albedo. And yeah, same for some other objects, some more tree bark that needed some adjustments. And finally, storing the USD. The USD layer, I'm saving that as a Handplaced, so it will save all those different layered USD, and also the shader modification will be saved in here. So the way I am actually connecting things to the rest of the scene here is with a GraftStage. So this is another lob that you can use if you need to not only merge content together, but also define a new location for those elements that are in the second input, this input right here. So in that case, it's, you see, originally everything was at the root. So we had mossy forest rock, tree bark, etc. And once I put that under my GraftStage with my relative path and this Handplaced folder, well, it's gonna drop everything that I had under this directory. So this way I make sure I'm keeping my organization consistent, and that's exactly what I want, right, for the purpose of this scene. So moving forward, we have more elements that are, in this case, Ivy. I'm generating those thanks to a plugin from Mark Chevery called IvyTaming. I already did a video about this in like a while ago, so I will refer you to this video. And you can use my link if you consider buying this plugin. And yeah, it's actually something I like to use a lot for generating this kind of things right there. So in that case, it's to bring some breakup on the ground, but also on the rocks and on the tree stump. So yeah, that's kind of giving me some nice detail. The way I go about it is a bit fiddly in this case. I could almost do a video just to show you how I'm doing USD and Ivy in that case. So I won't drag too much on that. But in the end, I'm making sure that everything is cached and have a path, well, a name attribute in that case with Ivy liana, and on the other side, Ivy leaves, and I'm merging everything together. And one final thing is in the sub create, if I'm using a sub create, I'm making sure that I'm importing everything as a point instancer. Because if you're trying to bring everything as, I don't know, X form, it means it will create a hierarchy, a primitive for every single leaf, which gonna be super slow and very inefficient. So that's where you wanna use a create point instancer. And yeah, things will basically be free and will run super fast. So in that case, I set the purpose to render for the Ivy. And that's a trick I like to use on very heavy objects. And if they don't have any proxy, well, I'm just setting that to render so that they don't appear in my viewport, but at least they can render anyway. So yeah, in that case for Ivy, I felt it was important. And yeah, same deal, I'm saving the USD thanks to a configure layer into a USD I'm calling Ivy Dressing A. So pretty neat stuff, and well, using another GraftStage to pull those Ivy under this Ivy Dressing directory right here. So yeah, once it's done, I basically move on to the next layer, which was the water puddles, right? In that case, it's a very simple plane that's created with a SOP import, okay? Everything, again, is set in a way that is saved. So usually I would just copy the SOP import. Everything is already set up. And if I need, I don't know, to change the primitive name, I don't know, object A, everything will be already set up. I don't have to worry about anything in here. My layer is already saved and I'm happy with that. And yeah, basically same in here. It will be based and reference this water name that is right here. So once it's merged in my scene, I have now some water puddles that will bring some nice detail. I actually also used that as a source for having some leaves floating, some debris. It always helps. Another piece of graph that is bringing my hero character, which is, well, a stag model I bought, I think on TurboSquid, I think, and did the grooming on this guy. So we have different position available. So sometimes I like to check under different configuration, the different pose, because yeah, that can help change the composition quite a lot. So all those attributes, I think it's cryptomats again, yeah, for the whiskers, for the horns, etc., the fur. Finally, I'm assigning some shader on whatever doesn't have shaders, like the terrain, the stag, the mud rocks pebble thingy. So all that kind of stuff, applying some shader on the ivy as well in here. So yeah, this phase is pretty much a fixing everything in the scene. And to do that, assign material library, that works great. And finally adding a layer of lights. So I have 2 or 3 light rigs, actually 4 light rigs actually. Those one are graphed within this kind of relative path where I'm putting everything under this light group, and I have a rig A in there. And in here, configure shot is basically the final USD thing that will encompass all those lights into the USD. I'm using Karma Fog, the Karma FogBox from Houdini 19.5 to deal with fog. It seems to work quite nicely and run fairly fast, so definitely give it a try if you haven't done so. At this point, it's pretty much ready to render, but well, let's see what we have. So if you're using Karma XPU, look, you would set that to Karma, and when you press D, you would set to XPU engine. And yeah, based on that, if you have a decent graphic card, it should be able to run fairly fast. Even with fog and stuff, it's still quite fast to iterate on stuff. So in that case, the terrain is pretty naked. That was just a good way for me to look dev my terrain, right? So I could actually turn off those fog so we can see a bit better what's going on once it's all loaded. Yeah. Now actually without fog, it's super fast, yo. Things are updating pretty instantaneously, really. Like if I'm checking in this camera, like for look dev, I found that actually very attractive. So to me, having everything set up with Material X makes sense because, well, first, Karma is rendering those super fast, and at the same time, some other engines or software might end up integrating this type of shader. That really depends on the developers, I guess, how much they are willing to invest in it. But I would really see the benefits of that, since it would make things much easier to exchange scenes between studios, between artists, and we wouldn't have to worry about redoing any shaders. So yeah, let's see how it looks actually when we reset all the scatters. So it's gonna take a while just to kind of load everything, but let's see. And yeah, look at that. We finally have some stuff showing up, and I mean, it's rendering quite fast considering the amount of object we have. The funny thing is when I manipulate the camera, while everything is rendering, feels actually very smooth, and actually even smoother than having the Houdini OpenGL. Yeah, it just feels even more stable to kind of work with Karma on than Houdini's crappy OpenGL, to be honest. So yeah, that's very cool. So of course, when we enable Karma FogBox, things would get a bit slower, but not too bad actually, considering like how tricky can be fog to render. So I have different preset of fog actually. This one is pretty heavy, but looks kind of cool actually. And the other one is with a much lower density and shadow density. It's much more like an atmospheric pass more than an actual fog, I guess. Yeah, so this one is much more subtle. So yeah, I will probably do a separate video when I talk about like maybe lighting or some look depth tricks specifically, because one video is not enough to cover everything if I don't want to spend 2 hours talking about, you know, random stuff. But yeah, we can get some pretty moody stuff, and I think it really helps to really art direct things and kind of push things to get better creative decision right here. So yeah, Karma in that case is very cool because we can experiment much more easily, I feel like, and it's just helping unlocking some creative decision. If I want to go to a sunset, I can easily do it, which like in past version, like version 18, I remember Karma was like that was way too slow for me, and now I think we are in a point where even though it's not real time, it's still kind of interesting for a path tracer because things are running quite fast actually. So yeah, like looking at the stronger fog, we can get some pretty interesting thing happening right there. Yeah. Actually, I have a bunch of different camera I can experiment with. So yeah, usually I like to spend a bit of time to just, you know, set some camera, set some lighting, and it's basically like doing photography, but with a much more control, because, well, you can control the position of your actor, control the position of your lights, of your fog, the amount of everything, and it's just a lot of fun to just experiment and see what kind of mood you can create out of it. So yeah, just right like there you can get a pretty epic shot with the light filtering through the trees, etc. And at the same time, if I change the rig to something else, you get something completely different as well. So yeah, I don't know, it's just very different for sure. So one thing I didn't mention actually is the procedural aspect of the scattering, where I like to expose at the root of the instancer some of the main parameters, like, you know, the density, the seed, and maybe some transform for some of the features, right? And use that straight while I'm in camera mode. So this way I can adjust on the fly, in that case for these trees, the amount of trees I want on this side, for example. Maybe I want less of it, so I'm gonna change this feature to 14. So yeah, now we got a different result on this side, and actually it might look a bit better. Maybe I want to increase the density on this side now and see how it looks. Maybe I'll try something like 16. Yeah, pretty cool. And actually I had also a controller that was blasting a lot of points on a specific area. So I wanted to kind of reveal some sky, and if I'm reducing that to 20, I should restore much more trees on the back. So yeah, in that case, it's probably looking a bit too dense, and that's why I reduced the amount of density of trees in the background, but maybe in some cases it's good to have it. Maybe if I try with a thicker fog, that could be a bit more interesting. Let's see. So yeah, I don't know, but it seems to me like the procedural aspect of Houdini and Solaris is extremely interesting when it comes to environment creation, and that's a thing that I really value when it comes to creative decision, is how we are able to iterate on environments. So that's pretty much it for today. I mean, there would be plenty more things to talk about, like AOVs, freaking render settings, USD export, and importing into other softwares, right? But that's already a lot of information for today. I hope this was useful, so if it was, please consider subscribing and check out the Gumroad store if you find anything useful in there. And yeah, I guess I'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.